everyone! In this video, I'm going to talk about how I approach writing English literature exam questions. And honestly, this video is for CIE GCSE exam, but I think it could work for any GCSE exam because these tips are pretty applicable and I genuinely hope it helps. So first I'm going to talk about the criteria because that's always important. After that, how I approach writing the exam, then the actual essay structure, and finally I'll look at an example essay and we can talk about it. Writing poetry answers and theater, prose, it's just so much, and suddenly you feel like you have to remember like 20 different things and you're just gonna collapse under the weight of the stress. But don't worry and breathe, because all you have to do is remember 4 points on the 0475 curriculum. And let's take a closer look. So for CIE, you have 4 main points called AO targets, like assessment objective targets. And the first point is to show that you actually understand the content of what's inside the prose or like the poetry. You have to do this through referencing quotes, and so you have to use the poem to recognize what's inside it. So you have to just clearly show that you understand that, for example, there's love explored. Second, you have to make references to meanings that are hidden. So don't just talk about like the curtains that are blue that you can see in the poem. Talk about the fact that these blue curtains show depression and they outline the whole house, so the whole house is enveloped in sadness. Oh, and for context, this is linked to the author's own struggle with mental illness. So that's AO2 with the context and with the meaning. Don't just say the curtains are blue, because the examiner knows. In AO2, it's different from AO1 because you have to show that you understand like the actual sub meanings, the meanings that are under, the meanings that are hidden, the implicit meanings basically. And number 3, we have language. So this is the part where you talk about this is a simile and this is a metaphor, and you have to use this to explain how the writer achieved the effect that they did. You have to show that you appreciate and admire the craft of writing, the way that the author decided to use this particular bit to make this particular atmosphere. And finally, number 4, this is the one that people always forget, and this is the personal response. Please never use I as a personal pronoun in your essay, but say things like, from a personal standpoint, this work, or like this. You have to show your feelings. You have to show that you either like this poem or you don't like this poem. And honestly, like, not to like sell yourself out, but usually just say that you like the work, and that's for your personal response. So that's the 4 criteria, and let's look at actually approaching the exam. Okay, so I talked about this before in my like how to prepare for the English exam, like about 2 months before the exam, or just to integrate like your study schedule with more revision tools to help you do better. But this approaching the exam is very important, and I'm not talking about the prep right now, although obviously you have to be able to recite what you think about the poems in your sleep. You have to know the text inside out. If I woke you up in the middle of the night, you should be able to do at least a summary. You don't have to tell me every like psychoanalytical part of the character, but a summary should be done. You should know the poems and you should know the prose. But I'm talking about what you do once you actually get to the point where you have the exam in front of you, you have your 3 pens. Please always carry like 3 pens with you, and you're getting ready to start. So what I do first is, for the CIE paper 1, there is a set poem and there's a set text, and you get 90 minutes. So 45 minutes for the poem and 45 minutes for the text. And you don't know which one it is, but for your sake, pray that it's a longer poem so that there's more to analyze. And obviously it's recommended that you spend 45 minutes on one and 45 minutes on the other. But I personally think that poetry is a lot harder for most people, and the questions tend to be a lot harder too. So I would spend maybe an hour on the poetry and 30 minutes on the prose. And what you do is you're going to just look at the question and you're going to pick, because they always give you a choice of 2 for both the poem and both the prose. They give you a choice of 2, and for 2 minutes and no more, just pick a question and realize that yes, I have things I want to say for this question. Don't pick a question because you want to be pretentious and like choose the harder question. Pick a question that you can actually answer, because at the end of the day, it's not about the difficulty of what you do. At the end of the day, it's just writing something really good that's gonna get you that 9 that you want and that you deserve. So let's say you pick the question. And also, just one more thing, I feel like a lot of people choose a question and then they don't commit to it. They'll get writing it and then they'll be like, but like my point isn't that strong. please think that out in advance, because there's nothing worse than starting your essay 10 minutes in, you're like, no, I want to write another essay. Just stick to your decision and be confident, and like if you did it, like screw that, just finish it, you know? So let's say you picked your question. This next bit is maybe questioning. It's not like the best advice, I guess, but if it works for you, it does work for me, and I hope it works for you, so you should try it. Don't bother annotating the poem because you simply don't have the time, especially because it's a set poem and a set text. You can get away with literally just learning it in advance. So all you need to do is reread the poem, then read the question, then reread the poem again. Take a pen, literally just underline the quotes that you're gonna use, write down your 3 points. I advise that you make a minimum of 3 very detailed points that you expand on, and then just start writing. And the thing is, I understand that this is like easy to say for the set poem text, but for unseen poetry, it's a bit more difficult. Honestly, do you really need a 5-color code system and to annotate everything? At the end of the day, you're the one analyzing. So if it's not a thought that you're gonna instantly forget, just do the same thing. Just underline it and just start writing the essay, because you have a little bit more than an hour and you just don't have the time to be sitting there for 20 minutes and figuring out this particular bit of the poem or that particular bit. You just need to get writing. Okay, so that's approaching the exam, and obviously there's one more thing I have to say, and that's always add more information, even if you think what you're saying is like obvious but you didn't actually say it. If you have the time, do it. It's not going to harm you. And also, I have said this multiple times before, but please learn to write quickly, because the most stressful thing is time. Remember, it's not the poem that you should fear, because you're doing all this extra preparation and you're gonna know the format and you're gonna actually know the poem for everything except for the unseen poem exam part, obviously. So just prepare and just be calm and get ready to write, because writing, last time I finished maybe about 3 minutes before the end of the exam, so please prepare to write. Okay, so let's say you did all that preparation and now it's time to actually write your essay. And I want to talk about the essay structure. So people have different essay structures, but personally I would stick to the PEEL structure, but make it spicier. Just add a little bit of that extra spice. And what I mean by that extra spice is that just add that extra tiny little bit of information, that extra tiny little bit of detail, an extra quote, an extra like pointing, zooming in bit there, and that's gonna carry you. The examiner is gonna look at that and think this is the classic traditional structure, and it's also just a great essay. So don't be spending time on being creative. Just stick to the basics and get the backbone of the essay done. I hope this isn't too much information that I'm throwing at you. Please also remember that you can change the speed of the video depending on how fast you intake information. And I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of everything. So the intro and conclusion are a little bit different. I'll talk about them specifically in the essay example, but the actual main body of the paragraph, you state your point, then you use a quote that backs up your point, and you repeat the point just one more time, but like in a different way to make it not obvious, but just so that the point is like fully ingrained in the examiner's mind. And then after that, you explain the quote, and then you zoom in into the little details in the quote and explain those. And after that, you can mention several other quotes linking to the bits of the quote that you just explained that also back up your point. And then what you're supposed to get is this expansion, and try and use a minimum of 3 quotes in your paragraph. And if you can't find the quotes, don't force it. But if you have extra quotes and you're like, do I need them? Yeah, you need them. As long as they're actually useful and they back up your point, they're not going to take marks off of you. They're going to take marks off of you if they don't think you explained it well enough, and they really want you to use those quotes because that's AO1, and they want you to explain the implicit meanings, and that's AO2. So please do all of that. In your explanation, you have to link the context, you have to link the personal response. And I'll give you an example. The reason that people mess up this essay structure is because they don't write the point and they don't write the explanation succinctly. I'm not going to give the best example, but here it is. I couldn't come up with anything better for the moment, but I hope you get my point, pun intended. So if the question is, how does the poet use language to create a certain atmosphere? You can't say the poet uses language to create a sad atmosphere as your point, because that's what they're asking. They're not asking you what sort of atmosphere they create. I mean, they are, but they're also asking you specifically about the language. So you can't just, as your point, say language in the answer. And I've seen people do that. And whenever you see that, like, that's an ultimate mark down, because then you don't have a clear point. So all your evidence, however well explained it is, doesn't back up the point. Every single bit of the PEEL structure is important. And also in your explanations, the reason that I say link back a lot, it's in the PEEL, is because you have to remind the examiner of your point, because that point has to be clear. So for this, for example, you could say, the poet masterfully uses juxtaposition to create a poignant emotional atmosphere. That's a point, because juxtaposition is language, and then the poignant atmosphere is like what they asked you that the poet creates. And also, I just want to make clear, when we talk about language, it's not just actual word choice, it's things like word order and like linguistic feels, like the way that the words link together. There's a lot to it. And so don't just be stuck in that mindset when you're like, okay, there's a word language in the question, so all I'm gonna say is just like word choice. Like, no, think beyond the box, but also remember the actual question, and don't answer the question in the point that you're making. And when I talk about expansion, I want you to think of the new Jessie song, Zoom In, Zoom Out, but instead of zoom in, zoom out, you do zoom out, zoom in. So it's like a reverse Jessie song. I hope this example is clear. I think it's just a very memorable way to get it into your head, that like first you start with the big quote, and then you move on to the little quotes. Because what people will do sometimes is they'll say the little quotes, and at the very, very end, they'll do like a big quote, and they'll like zoom back out into the point. And you can do that, but start with the big point first too, because you're supposed to make your point clear from the start. And if your point is at the end, people, like, it gets lost. People are used to reading first the point and then the explanation, because that's how most people write it. So even though, like, of course, by all means, test out your creative writing skills, like make up your new essay structure as long as it's effective, with all due respect, please don't do that for the exam, because people expect a certain something for you, and it's just something that you should do in order to get the most marks that you can get. But of course, just my advice. So now I have an example essay to show you, and I'm honestly a bit embarrassed to show you this, because I wrote this in 30 minutes in school with people talking around me, because it wasn't in exam conditions, but like I tried to just write it in exam conditions for myself, so I didn't look at my notes or anything. It's not the best essay because people kept trying to talk to me while I was writing it, and obviously I couldn't concentrate, and I just wrote it and I left it. But for this video, I think it's perfect because it gives us something to actually like point out and say, like, you know, this is this. Plus, I don't have any other better essays, since my better essays were the ones I actually wrote on the exam. So that's just a tip. Practice writing your essays, but also do your very, very best during the exam. Don't burn out beforehand. Okay, so this is obviously handwritten, and I also wanted to make a point of it being handwritten, just to show that like you can write 4 full pages in 30 minutes if you train your hand. And also my handwriting like isn't huge, it's just bad, but like other than that, you can do it. So I will read it to you, and I will tell you what I think is good and what I think needs to be improved, and how it addresses the AO targets. Because I've noticed that this essay, even though it wasn't the best, like it did get the full band, like the top band, the full marks from my teacher. And like his main point was to use more quotes, and I agree, because I literally did not follow my rule of using 3 quotes, and I was just rushing to get it done because I was being distracted. And yeah, just moral of the story, even if it's bad, just write it, because it'll give you something as a reference point from where you're starting. The question is, how does Walcott explore midlife crisis in Nearing 40? In the poem Nearing 40, Walcott masterfully explores the theme of aging and growing up and approaching the middle of his life. And then, the how, he employs meticulously chosen word choices and connotations to evoke powerful imagery that elicit a fierce response from the reader because of the vividness and impact on the senses. Again, showing personal response, because like I'm the reader, right? So personal response. And also it gives the examiner a clue about what you're going to talk about when you answer the question. So like at the end of the day, when they're tired, they'll just read your essay and they'll come back to the intro and the conclusion, and they'll be like, oh, yeah, right, they said that, that's the main point, okay, marks. Walcott writes, stream of consciousness, I can't read my own handwriting, and creates a tense atmosphere and fills the narrator's voice with anxiety, which coupled with the melancholy, accepting comparisons, accurately portray the full range of emotions synonymous with the midlife crisis. So what I think I could have done better here is that obviously this whole like synonymous with the midlife crisis, you get what I'm saying, but also everyone has different definitions of a midlife crisis. So I feel like this is just a common problem when you say something and you assume that everyone has the same definition as yours. So it would have been better to say like expected of a midlife crisis. It's also just a little bit long. But then again, I did actually have time to write the main point, and the main point is longer, and I think that that should be the main focus. Your main point should be like at least this much text broken down into paragraphs, because if you don't have that and you have 3 quotes, that means that you aren't explaining the quotes enough really, or you're choosing the quotes that you don't have anything to explain. Walcott uses a series of enjambments and an erratic rhythm with a full stop only at the end to create a sense of constant continuity. There's a lack in the variety of punctuation, and he chooses certain words whose syllabic pattern he breaks down, such as moving the ing in guttering onto line 14. The poem is not broken down into separate stanzas. It flows from beginning to end, with the only interruptions being that of the uneven breaks-ups in line. The pace and rhythm are random and follow no pattern, unlike the rigidly metered rain. New ideas are consistently introduced into the text, going from an ambiguous insomniac since 4, which could be both time and age, once again in allusion to the uncertainty the writer experiences at this stage in life, to deep, prodigious cynicism plants its seed. Only 20 lines later, with almost no discernible breaks. Because of this constant continuation with no clear pattern, yet an unceasing flow of ideas, the reader gets a sense of time passing without the narrator's consent. That's another thing. I'm just going to say this right now before I continue. This is still the same paragraph up to here, and that's a really bad habit, and I know I need to stop doing that. The paragraphs need to be split up better, but also the issue with splitting up paragraphs is that sometimes people get used to the structure so much that they sort of expect that every paragraph is a point. So seeing the same point carried over several paragraphs actually makes people think the essay is worse. So even though this is very bad, it's not supposed to be like that, because every new idea is a new paragraph. It also does like eliminate some of that uncertainty just a little bit. So I would just decide what you're going for, and if you can make it that every paragraph, every new point can still link back to the original point. And actually, since we paused, let's just go back to this. So the point here was that Walcott uses a series of enjambments to create a sense of constant continuity. What could have been done better here is that obviously after I said the sense of constant continuity, I should have linked it back to why that's reminiscent of a midlife crisis, and explain that at that point you feel like your life has been going on forever and you don't know what to do with the other half of the forever. So I could have also used it to address AO4 points and to say that like this is what I associate with a midlife crisis. I feel like I would be worried about turning 40 because this is it and I still see eternity approaching, right? Like that kind of thing. That's your personal response. It would have been even better if I actually linked this to the fact that that Derek Walcott's mentor, his like work started mostly at 40, and he was famed for his writing specifically after 40. And I could have mentioned this here, that there's a sense of continuity that even without the breaks here, it could be applied to his mentor, because he took no breaks, right? And he started his life, and so it's that your life isn't over. But the thing is, this point was more about the rhythm and about the actual enjambments, and even though I used the quotes and I used like carrying over to explain where it was, I feel like the rhythm could have been pinpointed better, and I could have actually talked about this, like the rhyme scheme, for example, which is non-existent, but I could have talked about it more. Like, yes, I mentioned that it's non-existent, but I could have explained why it's non-existent, if that makes sense. Like, I hope this essay example was helping you. The main thing that you should do to be critical of your own essays is to ask questions. So when you read it like it is the first time. I haven't read this for a while, I'm just reading it now, and I can tell you honestly that even though it sounds on the surface to be good, it could be much stronger and it could be presented much more coherently, even though it is an example of an essay that addresses the point and that gets in the top band. do better. He recognizes the passage of time, but all the pauses of life, all the events that wreck the order of his life, have no ultimate impact. The poem continues. During a midlife crisis, people often question their inherent worth as time continues to pass and they're in a state of in-between. 40 in more economically developed countries is almost exactly half of a typical lifespan, which causes people to reevaluate all that they have done and decide on what to do next. By breaking up the poem but ultimately having us stop only at the end, Walcott draws careful parallels to life and his feelings about nearing 40 and his life flowing with his actions, words, and melancholy emotions visible in the tone, taking no effect. The stream of consciousness technique also portrays the narrator as being overwhelmed with emotions. Most of the lines have their last word stressed, and Walcott employs rising rhythm, very symbolical of his ups and downs with life and anxiety he experiences at the constant oscillations. As modern readers, with the pace of life we typically lead, this seems all the more relevant. Okay, so this was much better than what I read during the first part. Even though this needed more quotes, this showed my actual explanation of why I think a midlife crisis is like this. So that addressed the question that we had in the first part. But do you see that if this was broken down into 2 paragraphs, it would literally not be as coherent because it's a new point. But I also don't mention the very first point that I made at the beginning, so this is more of an explanation, and so that's something that I need to work on more, the actual structure of your essay, and I do actively encourage you to please do this with your own essays and to take a very critical approach. What I think could have been done better here is the fact that I also talked about the stream of consciousness technique, and I know that it's Virginia Woolf, I know a ton of other writers who use that technique, and yet I don't mention it. And that's a problem. And I understand that it's all about time, but AO2 is context. It literally asks for you to show context. And yes, it's not directly context during the time, but it's like your external knowledge that you're linking in. You could actually explain what stream of consciousness is as a technique, like who popularized it, what you think the implications of Walcott doing this are. And there's just some other things here. So the good thing was that I actually talked about where in particular people find themselves in a state of in-between. So 40 in more economically developed countries is half of a typical lifespan. I didn't attempt to apply it to everyone, and there needs to be a tender balance between being like overly confident in yourself and also not trusting a word you say. Like once you've actually written it, please don't reread everything like 20 times because you're insecure about what you've written. Just move on and then come back to it at the end. And if you're really questioning it, leave some time to come back to it at the end, and remember to do those calculations in advance. So knowing that you have 3 points and, for example, 60 minutes, you get 20 minutes per paragraph, which is honestly a lot, and I would advise you to spend less and then to use that extra time to come back and to reread and to add. Another way Walcott demonstrates his brilliant grasp on language is by the sounds and the connotations he chooses to make comparisons to his youth and to now. That's another thing. I spelled now as no. When you read back over your essay, that's also something I didn't do. Again, bad, couldn't be bothered. Please do that in the actual exam, even though you're like, yes, I literally just spent an entire hour writing the essay. I know what I wrote. Still read over it, because it's these types of stupid mistakes that bring your grade down. And not only does this give a more personal emotional response to the reader and makes one marvel at the beauty of language, this also ties into the theme of constant uncertainty and the process of aging. Bleaching bedsheet. The alliteration coupled with the plosive B sounds evoke a bitter emotion along with the image of something devoid of color. It almost seems a contradiction and makes it difficult for the reader to grasp. It makes one question the validity of their emotions. If even the bitterness and the strength of the emotion at no longer being at the forefront of ideas loses its color. If that has no value, it makes one ask if their emotions have no value, and one should simply accept with resignation the despondent situation of their midlife crisis, exactly the crisis that many experience at 40. Conventional for convectional. Convectional brings the reader to hot air rising above, and this idea of someone being ahead is ubiquitous in the narrator, who sees himself as being left behind. Even in the rhythm, the very notion of his life is deeply questioned. Louver's gap evokes an image of two sheets and the word narrower in front contradicts the image. Louver's gaps are made for air to pass through. By narrowing it, Walcott shows how his life is becoming more and more stifled. Simple shining lines. The sibilant sound makes a shimmering sound, something we can associate with a soft S, something pleasant, perhaps, something shiny, and this makes it all the more difficult to lose this precious and pleasant way of life. Walcott truly draws the reader into the feelings of crisis, as everything seems within reach but out of grasp. It's one page. There are no paragraph breaks. Reading this feels like I'm going through an existential crisis and doing that thing that Walcott is doing about it being stream of consciousness and just like letting it all out. Oh, I know that's sibilant, so I'm just gonna write it sibilance. Even though I'd always advise you to put that extra detail, sometimes you just have to look at your work and be like, this needs to be split and this needs to be made simpler, even though I want to show my ability as a writer. So I hope that my technique and actually like judging and explaining the essay is becoming clearer. So actually I want to just temporarily go back to the introduction and remember how in the introduction I talked about the fact that Walcott uses word choices and connotations and imagery and it's a vivid impact on the senses and the stream of consciousness. This is literally what I just read to you in these first 3 pages. So your introduction should directly say just what you're going to say, and we'll get to the conclusion later and we'll see how the two of them differ and yet are similar in many ways. The idea of looking out of a frosted pane, with life being just on the other side of the glass, but at 40, overwhelmed by emotions, we lose our clarity and clear view, our vision thickens, our viewpoints distort. It forces us to judge what was previously noticed with joy, with the bleak modesty of middle age. Our bright passion and emotions that burn so fiercely before turn into a false dawn. By comparing life now, as he nears 40, to the good times of before, and employing these sounds which sometimes usurp and contradict the calm, Walcott demonstrates his emotions and explores the complexity and difficulty in the constant comparing before and now when experiences during a midlife crisis. Finally, people experiencing I did actually say finally. Oh, that's another thing. When it gets to the conclusion, don't say in conclusion. When you get to the last point, say things like finally to show that this is not the conclusion just yet. Finally, people experiencing a midlife crisis typically find treasure in a state of constant questioning and reevaluating their life choices. Walcott fills nearing 40 with thought-provoking existential musings. His every line, along with comparisons, word choice, and rhythm, bring the reader back to the most important question of why. Why are we here? What is our purpose? If our time is limited and we seem doomed to be reduced to merely a dry wheezing, eventually resigned to be content with just enough, then how must we live to make it worth it? Even when it seems to weep, Walcott draws parallels from nature. Even the rain cries at the future of humanity, and every careful choice and allusion Walcott makes perfectly reflects a midlife crisis in nearing 40 and is the state of self-questioning for many readers. I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room right now, and that's the fact that this isn't a conclusion. There isn't a conclusion at all, and that fills me with absolute dread, with absolute shock, with absolute I want to drown, where is my conclusion? Just like I'm having an existential crisis over this final essay because it was good, but because it didn't have a conclusion, it messed everything up. So obviously it wasn't the best essay, but it would have been in the top band because it actually addressed the objectives, and that's what I want to say. If you're reading this and if you're thinking like, oh, I don't write like that, I write differently, you're not wrong. Please listen to this. I'm not an expert. This is just the way that I write. Your way of writing is valid too, as long as you just follow the structure of actually explaining your points and like addressing the objectives that I mentioned at the beginning. What should we say in the conclusion that doesn't exist here? So your conclusion should be like your introduction, but different. And I want to just go back to the introduction for a second. Oh, and by the way, here is the annotated version of Nearing 40 that I didn't use, but you should at least do this before the exam to show that you have those annotations. So in my introduction, as you remember, I said he employs meticulously chosen word choices and connotations to evoke powerful imagery that elicit a fierce response because of their vividness and impact on the senses. He writes stream of consciousness. He creates a melancholy accepting comparison comparison, it portrays the full range of emotions synonymous with the midlife crisis. You're supposed to say the exact same thing in the conclusion, but just do it better. So what you're supposed to say in the conclusion is literally what I just said, but you need to also say the question. My throat is so tired from talking continuously for like an hour. Thank you so much for listening. I hope the video helped. Just do whatever you want to do, but prepare for the exam, and I'm sure you'll do great. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.